going to talk about some of the cultural significance of cocaine and how it's made and how it is distributed, and we're kind of trying to answer the question of like why cocaine is seen as such a bad thing. Like, specifically, how does a harmless plant that can be transformed to a destructive drug disrupt the culture associated with it in the US and Latin America? I'm Natalie.
My name's Jelani.
I'm Adara.
And we're here today to discuss cocaine. So basically, this is important because it shows how another country, when they have enough power, can change the trajectory of a different country. And that's not always a good thing. Sometimes it has racial motivations, sometimes it has financial motivations or incentives for the stronger country. And all of those things can end up really bad or really hurt the smaller country.
Okay, so like most things, there's a history of it. And so the brief history of coca in Bolivia is that it dates back to the Inca Empire. So during the time of the Incas, coca was a very sacred plant. Only the Inca nobility could consume it, and exceptions were made for the chasquis, the people who ran through the mountains transmitting messages, and children who were going to be sacrificed during the Capacoca ritual.
Well, that's nice of them.
When famine was occurring, the general population was also allowed to consume coca as well. A ritual would be performed before eating it or chewing it, and it's sometimes still performed today. So it would start off with holding 3 coca leaves with 2 hands and offering them above your head. Then the leaves are blown to show respect for the various gods of nature. Only after this ritual would the leaf be consumed. After the Spanish and Portuguese colonized South America and the Inca Empire was no longer, coca was still being consumed. The Spanish in particular did not like the plant, but could not make it disappear from society. So there are a lot of reasons why Bolivians grow coca today, despite the many, many efforts throughout history to stop the growth of the plant. So the 2 main reasons are the traditional uses of the plant, but also for economic reasons. The traditional uses of coca include tea, medicines, rituals, and it also helps to reduce the feeling of altitude sickness or fatigue in higher elevations in the Andes. It works as a stimulant and it helps with indigestion. Coca has also been used in new ways over recent decades. This includes soda, chocolate, candies, liqueurs, capsules, extracts, creams, infusions, energy drinks, and even toothpaste. For many Bolivians, growing coca is also a way to make ends meet. Bolivia has faced decades of high unemployment and poverty. During the 1960s drug boom, Bolivians turned to refining and manufacturing cocaine from the coca plant. This has led to the Bolivian economy becoming dependent on coca and cocaine production. So, the coca plant can be harvested between 2 and 6 times per year, which means a higher economic yield for coca farmers. When the plant is harvested, the coca farmers also harvest the seeds, which they then use to make more coca. Then they take the leaves and dry them. Depending on the weather, the drying process can take as little as 6 hours, but if it is raining, the leaves cannot be dried as too much moisture can destroy the leaves. There are 2 main regions in Bolivia that grow coca, the Yungas and the Chapare. Both of these regions are located on the eastern slopes of the Andes. The Yungas region has seen coca cultivation for hundreds of years, and this is where more of the legal growing occurs. The coca is planted between 4,800 and 6,000 feet in elevation on terraced fields with steep slopes. Having steep slopes is important with coca growing, so when it rains, the coca isn't flooded. The Chapare region is located in lower elevation, and the coca there is grown between 660 and 1,650 feet in elevation. Most of the coca growing in Chapare ends up being manufactured into cocaine. As most of the coca grown in Chapare is destined to become cocaine, most eradication efforts prior to coca legalization and most of drug-related violence has occurred in this area, especially in relation to Law 1080.
Alrighty, so we're going to talk about the politics of coca in Bolivia. So pretty much to start out, I'm going to start out with the Cato Accord. So pretty much in 1961, in the Single Convention on Narcotics Drugs, the international law classified that the coca leaf is a dangerous drug alongside cocaine and heroin. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs is pretty much an international treaty that controls activities such as cultivation, production, supply, trade, and transport of specific narcotic drugs, and lays down a system of regulations such as licenses, measures for treatment, research, etc. In 1976, Bolivia signed the convention. The law pretty much stipulated that the government must eliminate all coca bushes within their territory, and this also included wild coca bushes. The traditional practice of coca leaf was also, or like the chewing of it, was also to be abolished within 25 years of ratification. So if you fast forward a couple years into the mid-1980s, the United States had launched a coca eradication campaign in the Chapare, which, if you wanted to talk about like distance-wise, that was around 6,000 square kilometers. Initially, the process was carried out in collaboration with the coca grower communities, and also there were U.S. trained forces and troops that were sent in as well. So pretty much what was happening during this process was the state of Bolivia had paid farmers compensation, which came out to roughly be $2,000 in U.S. currency for every hectare which was eradicated. So if you want to know like the length of a hectare, that came out to be roughly 2 acres or 2 football fields roughly. And then on July 19th, 1988, the Bolivian Congress passed Law 1008. It was pretty much under strong pressure from the U.S. government to pass this law. The law made it illegal to cultivate the coca leaf with the exception of expressly permitted circumstances for centuries. Many coca growers in the Chapare were known as the Chapare colonizers. They couldn't claim cultural heritage as traditional cultivators. The youngest coca growers could, however, because they had been cultivating the coca leaf for more than 1,000 years, which equates to more than a millennium. They had rituals that accompanied labor in the fields and reciprocal modes of labor organizations known as Aini, as a means for reproduction of social identities. The Chapare didn't have underlying elaborate understandings and practices that the youngest had. The Chapares would douse the crop in fertilizer and pesticide. And also many of the Chapare didn't want to disclose the location of their plantations to their neighbors. And the reason for this was because they had the fear that if they were to disclose the location of their plantations, then they would be denounced by their neighbors to the police, which caused a lot of tension among the Chapare. As for like an effect that Law 1008 caused on Bolivia, it presumed the guilt of those that were accused and wouldn't allow the accused to fully exercise their right to legal defense. It prohibited bail or provisional liberty, and it established excessively long judicial processes. In 1992, the prison population was as high as 8,500, and pretty much 92% of the people who were in prison within the prisons were they were imprisoned without a sentence. And due to overcrowding, many of the prisoners slept in open patios. So in 1997, the Banzer administration attempted to gain favor with the U.S. Embassy. So they launched the Dignity Plan. This plan had tried to accelerate the eradication campaign of the coca bush, which aimed to destroy the entire chapate crop by the year 2002. When this was passed, the U.S. hailed this as a significant victory on the quote-unquote war on drugs. However, this success came at a high social cost. The eradication outpaced the provision of production assistance. So pretty much people who could measure the amount of the hectares being destroyed, they weren't able to keep count. And this caused the coca grower families to plunge into a severe economic crisis. As I had mentioned earlier, U.S. trained and funded forces were also sent in to eradicate the coca plant. And because they were in Bolivia, they had committed a range of atrocities such as murder, rape, theft. They were torching homesteads. They were also taking parts in beatings, and they were also torturing the individuals that lived in the chapate. Under the terms of the anti-drug law 1008, hundreds of farmers were arrested for drug-related offenses on little or no evidence and were held indefinitely without charge. The U.S. also provided coca farmers with assistance to encourage them to grow legal crops, or they tried to rather. Many of the locals say that the U.S. Agency for International Development, or known as the USAID, did little to improve their lives. The USAID promoted tropical products such as pineapples, palm heart, and bananas, and the locals stated with the lack of markets for these tropical products, it would make more sense to let the crops rot in the fields rather than go to the expense and effort to harvest them. The USAID also did very little to stimulate the local economy, as well as only generated a handful of low-paying jobs. The USAID also had a policy of non-collaboration with the coca unions, which sowed a lot of mistrust and provoked division within the coca grower communities. Many local farmers believed that the USAID intended to break the union through a strategy called divide and rule. Throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, the coca unions led mass protests and marches and road blockades. Due to this, these kind of made the country seen as ungovernable. So between the years 2000 and 2004, there were pitched battles that took place in the city streets. This was done as a way to express unpopularity of the neoliberal model. The main cause of these battles was the privatization of water, gas, and the International Monetary Fund's imposition on an exorbitant income tax. This made it so that coca growers were not able to grow coca. Well, it was like kind of a part that played into it. The chapate coca growers were at the forefront of protests against the neoliberal state, and it can be linked to resistance to globalization and neoliberalism. The country was seen as ungovernable, as I had stated. So in 2004, President Carlos Mesa conceded to the chapate farmers' demands. So he permitted each union member the right to grow a limited amount of coca, which is also known as cato. In total, 7,000 hectares of coca could be grown in the chapate, and another 1,000 hectares could be grown in transitional zones. And then in 2008, the coca grower unions announced that they would no longer sign new aid agreements with the USAID.
So until the U.S. gets involved, nobody really has a problem with coca production or growth.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay. So just so we're all on the same page, the U.S. decides to interfere in a country that is not their own, which seems to be a clear violation of sovereignty, and influence policy, which is something we ourselves would not stand for happening in our country. And then we change the course of the country's history.
Yeah.
All right. On the same page.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So with USAID and trying to like have coca growers start growing like tropical fruits and stuff, do you think that was due to the United States just not liking coca and they really didn't have any motivation to like help economic growth in Bolivia? That it was just to get rid of coca, if that makes sense?
Yes, it does. So I think that the United States had tried to implement those tropical fruits into their economy because I guess they could have seen that as a way to do like legal trade amongst like Bolivia and the US or other countries, because I'm pretty sure that those tropical fruits were probably seen as like what is it? They were kind of rare. They were kind of uncommon and exotic. So they tried to replace those fruits with coca, so that way they could have something legal. But I don't think that the United States took into account that in Bolivia, a lot of people didn't even know what those fruits were, and they probably didn't even want to try them. They probably were used to their more cultural stuff, and as such, the people saw that as like a spit in the face, pretty much, because coca or the coca leaf itself is like the main way that they got their profit.
Right. So you're not even trying to understand their culture. You're just throwing what you think they would want, you know.
Yeah.
Sounds about American. All right. So the thing that I find, one of the things I find most interesting in this process is the way that it's actually made. And I know I've, throughout the planning of this podcast, I know I've expressed this a lot of times, but the amount of chemicals that it takes to make cocaine, I have no idea why anyone would have a desire to put that in their nose. I really don't. But so that you guys can share my dumbfoundedness, I'm going to take you through briefly the process of actually making just the paste that makes cocaine. So this is one element of what makes cocaine, or what brings it from coca to coca paste, and then later on it's produced into cocaine. But this is the main element. So you have a 2-month period every year where you can harvest the coca. So it's growing on the, how do you say that word? The amount of space?
Hectares?
The hectares, there we go. I was going to say hectares, and that wasn't. Anyways, it's growing on these hectares, and generally it's not like one family that owns the whole hectare or something. It's either like a collaboration kinda or something like that, where they have their area that they're growing, but they have a 2-month span where they can actually be harvesting and taking care of this coca. So they pick it by hand, which is amazing when you 2 football fields worth that they're picking by hand. And then they take that hand-picked coca leaves and they mulch it. So they put it through like a weed eater or something to like whack it up. And then this is where we go from natural and organic to, why would you put that in your nose, man? So they mulch it and then they put cement in it to bind it, because it's just these like broken down leaves at this point, so they need something to like hold it together to get it through the rest of the process that's going to make it into a paste. So now we've added cement, so that's step 1 of not for me. And then they go from adding the cement to now they put it in like barrels basically, and they take the cemented mulched coca plant, and now they're adding in the things like gasoline and what else do they add? They add gasoline, they add a ammonia, they add sulfuric acid, sodium permanganate, it kind of looks like pomegranate, but that's not it, and caustic soda. And they add all of that to the gasoline mulched cemented coca leaves in order to produce like a liquid. They're trying to produce a alkaloid, I think is how you say that. And that liquid, like throughout the rest of the process, they want to keep it liquid until they cook it off or fry it up, is what they call it, fry it off. But the way they do that is with a crap ton of chemicals. And so then once the chemicals are there and they just keep mixing and mixing, and they're just, they've been doing this for generations. So they're pretty good at knowing when this is ready. So they're just kind of mixing. They do most of the work inside of their homes. So they have these toxic chemicals that they're doing inside their homes for a couple of months, because when the final products are done, they make enough money to kind of like sustain for a while. So this isn't a year-long thing that's going on. They have other jobs in the off season. Usually farmers are farming more than one crop, basically, but coca is like their most profitable crop that they do during the year. So then they have this liquefied coca, they bring it home, it's in their kitchens. They start the process of frying it off, which is basically cooking it to evaporate the liquid that is made entirely of chemicals. And they fry it off. Obviously, they have to do that with mask on because ammonia and all those other things. So they fry it off to make it like this dry paste. And they basically just keep mixing and breaking down that paste until it eventually forms into a vat of liquid, is one of the byproducts, and that's called nata, which means buttermilk. It doesn't look like buttermilk. I'm sure it doesn't taste like buttermilk, but it's called buttermilk. And then that's one of the byproducts of it. And then they have a paste that they can kind of like pull out, and I'm sorry, I wish that you could see the pictures, podcast people, but it looks just as disgusting as what I'm describing. But anywho, so then they break it down, they pack it up, and they sell it, and they're able to get about $900 per kilo of cocaine paste. Or coca paste. And then that coca is like, this is the one that gets me. Yeah. That coca paste, you can sell it at local markets or barter and trade for it, or you can sell it to the drug dealers, drug trade organizations, who then take it. Most of their clients are in like Amsterdam or America. And that is where our fun adventures begin. That fume is eating away our ozone. So there's no way that fume is not toxic, even if it's not the actual chemical component of like liquid gasoline anymore. There's no way it's not toxic anymore. There's no way. Like in nothing that we have researched, read, or talked about, am I seeing the line between where it is a toxic chemical composition and where it's not. And I know we're going to talk about the line culturally between when it's like, just a cultural thing that's done, like the growing and the picking of the coca plant for non-harmful, non-addictive consumption, and then what we view it as America. But like, it would begin and halt all things with me when you got to mix in cement. Like that for me would be the line. But it's wild to me that that's not the line for everyone. It's like, oh no, it has to cause an addiction for it to be harmful. Like the process of making it should be enough.
Coca obviously has to eventually reach manufacturers, and that's the start of like the distribution pipeline. So first of all, Bolivia has also implemented social control efforts in relation to coca production. So the goal of social control efforts is to create a stable price for coca, which will in turn provide a stable baseline income for farmers and their families. Social control has had a lot of success where there are strong coca unions and also that they're committed to the government and their coca policies. The farmers and unions that are committed to social control efforts are also committed to selling coca to legal markets. However, there are farmers who aren't as dedicated to social control, and they will sell coca leaves to whoever is willing to buy it, whether it be a legal market or a drug manufacturer. However, some of that is due to growing coca in rural areas because they also have to get the coca to legal markets. So, in Lisa Farthing and Benjamin Cole's article, Social Control, Bolivia's New Approach to Coca Reduction, they say getting coca to legal markets in towns far from small remote farms presents another difficulty facing the government in keeping coca out of the drug trade. Drug traffickers do not necessarily pay more than the legal market, but they do travel through the countryside, buying the leaf along the roads in sparsely populated areas. Many impoverished farmers with no strong political commitment or obligation to the social control program often will sell the leaf to a buyer who shows up before they transport the leaf to a market. Some coca ends up going to drug manufacturers because drug manufacturers will go to the farmers directly. For coca to end up in a legal market, a farmer has to take the coca there instead. This is hard for rural farmers, so they will sell to drug manufacturers who come to them instead. So even if they're committed to social control efforts, it's also a means of transportation as well. After coca leaves are dried, they are bought to processing facilities and/or markets. However, for the production of coca paste, sometimes the dried leaves are processed at or near the farm to cut down on transportation of dried leaves. So there are many drug trade routes out of Bolivia. So Bolivia is a landlocked country, so most drug trade routes out of the country or by land using private vehicles or commercial trucks. A small percentage of cocaine is transferred via airplanes and boats on rivers. After leaving Bolivia, cocaine that is brought to Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay tends to end up in Europe. Drug routes going north through Brazil, Peru, and Colombia will end up in North America. Once the cocaine ends up in Colombia, it is transported mainly by sea to Panama. From Panama, it is smuggled by land, air, and sea to Costa Rica. After Costa Rica, the routes go to Nicaragua and El Salvador. To Nicaragua, it is once again transferred by air, land, and sea. However, to El Salvador, it is primarily smuggled by sea. From Nicaragua, cocaine goes to Honduras and Guatemala. Cocaine is primarily smuggled by air to Honduras, and from Nicaragua to Guatemala, it is smuggled by both land and air. From Honduras to Guatemala, it is smuggled by both land and air, and from Guatemala, drugs are smuggled through Mexico and then on to the U.S. Most cocaine that ends up in the U.S. is brought in through Mexico. Very little ends up in the U.S. by other means. The Sinaloa cartel out of Mexico uses a variety of ways to get drugs out of the country, such as boats, trains, helicopters, cargo planes, and even narco submarines. So, along the way, there are a bunch of DTOs, and drug trade organizations are obviously present for most every step of the drug distribution pipeline. Mexican DTOs have the largest presence in the U.S. and control most of the U.S. drug market, partially due to their strong ties with gangs in the U.S. Mexican DTOs use gangs to distribute drugs in the U.S., as the DTOs can avoid detection from law enforcement that way. All of these countries have varying levels of DTO violence, though. Bolivia tends to have lower DTO violence than most other countries involved in the drug trade. Many note that this is the case because of the cultural norms surrounding the plant. Countries such as Colombia and Mexico stand out because of DTO violence. These two countries also have many DTOs that work to distribute drugs internationally. Some cartels that stand out especially are the Sinaloa cartel out of Mexico and the Gulf Clan cartel from Colombia. The Sinaloa cartel is Mexico's largest cartel and has operations not only in Mexico, but also in Colombia and the United States. It is also considered to be the largest and most powerful drug trade organization in the world, and arguably more powerful than Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel in Colombia at its prime. The Gulf Clan cartel is not only a DTO, but also a neo-parliamentary group out of Colombia. No one knows the exact number of members this cartel has, but it is known to recruit high-ranking members from the military, such as generals and colonels. Unlike the Sinaloa cartel, which deals with a wide variety of drug distribution and money laundering, the Gulf Clan cartel handles primarily cocaine. They also participate in civil violence with other guerrilla groups in Colombia.
So, along the way on these trade routes, not trade route, is trade route the right word? Distribution pipeline is better.
Yeah.
I like that better. 'Cause trade route sounds so like innocent, you know? Anyways, along the way of these distribution pipelines, obviously their goal is to make it to their consumer market. So for the US, who is the highest consumer of all illicit drugs in the world, so everybody gets a medal. Border states play a huge part in that. So Florida, Texas, California, even Louisiana, play a huge role in drugs coming over the border and then being kind of distributed through cartels, through drug trade organizations to, your gangs and local drug dealers, your neighbor drug dealer Phil, guy that hangs out on the playground at the high school with his backpack right in front of him and just has these little baggies in it. Not that I've ever met Phil. I'm just saying there's a guy.
Phil exists.
His name is Phil. The process in that is not so much complicated as it is very violent and very like secretive in a way. So basically, if the goal is to not get caught, if you get caught, the goal is to not get taken to jail in most cases. So there happens to sometimes be gunfire involved and an attempt to an escape. Usually when you do go to jail in these situations, you don't want to be the guy that snitched on the drug trade organization. And this is something that we find a lot of not success. What's the opposite of success? Failure. Yes.
Yeah.
We find a lot of failure in trying to turn people in cartels. We actually have a very low success rate with that because of the scariness of a cartel. Like, if you're going to snitch on a drug trade organization, you know that not just you, but your entire family is probably not going to be long for this world. So we don't have a lot of success on turning those people. We have a low level of success on keeping the drugs from even crossing over our borders, because no matter how many bust or we can be as successful as possible, we confiscated a few 100,000 kilos over the summer last year, and still millions more can make it into the country and be distributed. So it's a really complicated issue when it comes to keeping these drugs out. And one of the things that made it more complicated is the shifting dynamics of the trade or the distribution pipelines, because they shifted from Central, or not from Central America, from directly from they're coming straight from Colombia, straight from Bolivia into the U.S. to now Mexico is the main hub. So all roads kind of are leading to Mexico at this point when it comes to cocaine and heroin and fentanyl and things like that. Everything leads to Mexico, which is right on the border of all those states that we just talked about. And from there, everything gets taken into the country. And it's hard, it's literally a line in the sand for what our border is. Drug trade organizations have been known to be as ingenious as flying small drones, like personal drones, which only are going to hold a kilo or something over the border just to test limits. So they're very creative on how they're getting these drugs over. There was a story I was reading about a barrel, just a regular barrel, probably not wooden, even though that might be what popped in everybody's head. But there's a lot of rivers and things that separate our two countries, and just a barrel floating across that was full of drugs. And this is back towards the beginning of all of this, but they've been innovative enough to get drugs across that way, to get drugs across on the bottom of what looks like just debris from things falling apart in the ocean. So they're getting more creative, and the drugs are coming across, and it's hard to really stop it. It's hard to even figure out where to stop it. And I think you have the chemical composition, and you have the illegality of the act of actually getting cocaine. Because it's not like with, let's say, Adderall, where if you see somebody with Adderall, they could have legally gotten this Adderall through a prescription, or maybe they bought it from their friend who legally got it, But with cocaine, if somebody's got coke, they got that illegally. You are now involved. You are an accomplice to something. You need to leave the room, So that, I think, is what gets us into that stigma of it. And then the other component of when we're talking about cocaine now. We've gone from coca plant, and now we're firmly in cocaine territory, and the stigma that comes with cocaine. The other component is how addictive cocaine is, and that addiction can be destructive in a lot of ways. So cocaine is one of the top 5 most abused drugs. It has millions of users and addicts. It's very easy to buy cocaine. Some readings even say that it's almost as common as marijuana now to buy. It actually is only a little bit behind marijuana as one of the most used drugs. So not only addictive, but like people are actually using it, which that was weirdly surprising to me. Maybe because I just have never known anybody that's done cocaine or admitted to it. But that was weirdly surprising to me that people are actively in 2023 still doing cocaine. Wild. But anyways, most users or addicts are between 18 and 25 at first use. And they're most likely, that's the age group that is most likely to become addicted. So when we start talking about the stigma here, we have young adults who are in college age, and who are, probably their families are thinking they're going to go to college and do something here, and then they're cocaine addicts, and then cocaine leads to other drugs. And so then I think we're building a bit of a stigma around that as well, around just the group that is mainly affected is such a tragic group. When someone dies and they're 18 to 25, the first thing people say is, oh, they're so young, they had their whole lives ahead of them, things like that. So when you see someone's life completely destroyed, that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And when you see that over and over and over, and in the 80s and early 90s, I know you guys weren't there, but in the early 90s, this was such cocaine led to crack, led to inner city crack epidemics, and crack and HIV were the things, and they were destroying families, they were destroying neighborhoods, and it was devastating to watch people that were already impoverished, say that word?
Impoverished.
There. Be just decimated by cocaine and cocaine byproducts. It was really, really sad. I was reading where I was at.
Yeah.
Speaking of stigmas and stereotypes. No, before, I just want to touch on, speaking of that cocaine and crack epidemic, there's a line that I feel like any conversation about cocaine would be missing out if we didn't investigate the racial divide that is inherent in a cocaine discussion. So cocaine is seen as this rich white party drug. And I think perhaps cocaine is even somehow seen as better to do than crack. If you think of a crackhead versus a cokehead, you know what I'm talking about. Like, if you think of this, like when you're growing up, when you see these depictions on TV, cokeheads are rich fraternity brothers that are just having a good time on a Friday night. Crackheads are like willing to do anything with their dirty clothes and foul smells, and they're just willing to do anything for just one little hit. So even the depiction of the two, even though essentially it's the same drug, the depiction of the two is very different, and a lot of that comes down to the racial divide, because crack is a black drug. Crack is something that poor black people do. This is the stereotype. And cocaine is something that rich white people do. So you have socioeconomic divides, you have racial divides, and it's the same drug. It's the same drug. It has the same basic chemical composition. One is in a different form than another. One is inhaled versus snorted. But it's the same drug. And so that is fascinating to me as well, that the same drug can be considered so radically different depending on the population that is doing it. And I think that a lot of the reason that cocaine has such a stigma still today is because black people were able to do it. And so then it became stigmatized. Like, this is something that we, I think, talked about at some point in the planning of all of this. But like, back when Coke was going into Coca-Cola, that became an issue, not because it went into a soda, which should have been an issue because kids was drinking soda. It wasn't that. It's because it went into a soda that black people could buy. So then they were literally, this is a direct quote here. They were worried about strong black Negro men raping their innocent white women. That was the fear. It wasn't that cocaine was in a beverage. It was simply because black people had access to that beverage and that it would make them strong and like indestructible. And then, of course, because black people are evil in the opinion of these people, they would then go on some kind of rape spree. And that was the fear. And so I think if I had to make an historical based argument on why cocaine is so stigmatized, I would say it is because black people had access to it. And that is where the stigma kind of began.
I think that's especially true with like the government standpoint of cocaine and all of the policies they've enacted in regards to like cocaine and just other drugs in general. But like when I looked up things of like how like cocaine is perceived in the US and then like examples of just cocaine throughout history beyond, you know, like when it first came about in the United States, there's something that I found interesting, and it comes from former House Representative Madison Cawthorn, who's a Republican out of North Carolina.
Funny guy.
And I know he claimed, though, that he witnessed members of Congress snorting cocaine. And so it's one of those things of rich white people is different than black people doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's where it's like, it's regardless cocaine.
Anywho, so tell me about the Harrison Act.
Harrison Act of 1914 was the first law that limited cocaine and other narcotics. And it was implemented after Taft's presidency, but he also declared that cocaine was public enemy number one. And so it's interesting how, like, cocaine's been around since the 1800s in the United States, but the history in terms of, like, laws and stuff enacted towards it had started over 100 years ago. And just all of that. But then by the 1950s, cocaine was considered just a thing of the past.
It's really weird to me that, not weird in like a bad way, but I guess fascinating is a better word, that marijuana has become increasingly destigmatized over the last, let's say, century. So you had the whole, what was that movie about weed that like started it all? It was
Was it How High?
No, God, way before your time. Okay. No, way before my time. I'm talking like way back. It was like marijuana is a killer or something. It was like this really old movie. I will have to get the title for you guys. But it was this really old movie, and it kind of started the panic surrounding marijuana. And that's when you saw like a lot of laws being passed about it, and it was like, it was a wild movie. If you watch it now, you're going to be like, what the hell? But in such a short, relatively short time in comparison to how long, humans have been alive. So like less than a century, marijuana is now legalized in some fashion in 44 out of 50 states. Like some states, it is completely legalized. Like you can just go right up to the store and buy it. Virginia. Shout out to VA. Not a store, but you can buy it anywhere.
Yeah.
But cocaine has not, followed that same track, which is great. I'm not saying it should, but I just find it fascinating that one is becoming like destigmatized while the other one is like staying like at a plateaued level. Like, I don't think there are more people that are, I honestly, and maybe this is me just being naive, how does someone get you to do cocaine in 2023? A first-time user, what are you doing? Where are you at? Who are you around? Where they're like, here's some cocaine, and you're like, yeah.
So you said the age range was like 18 to 25, so I'm pretty sure like the
College?
typical place, so it would be colleges. So you would see someone in like a frat house, probably would be like in a bathroom. It might be in like someone's like public room, or it could be like at the bar, and like someone just sees the white stuff and they're just like, hey, you want to have a good time? Here. And they just get that line going, and I guess they feel that rush, and they feel that high.
Reefer Madness. That's the movie, sorry.
I think there's also a lack of education of how cocaine is made. It's like with pot, it's a plant, it's dried, it's smoked.
Right.
Cocaine, it's a plant, it's dried, and then we've got the rest of it.
Right. I really think that you're right. I think people might think that cocaine is literally just a plant that gets chopped up.
Yeah.
And then that's what you're snorting. Like, there's no way that everybody is aware of all of this stuff that goes into making cocaine. There's just no way. How would you still do it? How would you, like, No. But one thing I want to make sure we cover, the portrayal of cocaine in movies, because I also think this is really interesting, because cocaine is often portrayed in movies, and this is where I find the distinction. In movies that are meant to be comedies, that is where I see white people dealing, taking cocaine into consideration in any way, is when a movie's supposed to be a comedy. But in serious movies that are trying to like replicate real world, like Godfather, like, what's that other one? I'm not good with movie names, let's just stick with Godfather. Anyways, it's always a minority group. It's always either some like Latin American nationality or black people, and they're always in gangs, and they're always super violent, like, and it's always like we ride at dawn type, those kind of violent situations. But in the like grand scheme of things, in reality, the statistics do not support that at all. So I think a lot of the stigma is connected to what you see and what you know about cocaine growing up is all like this drug that's just done in like the poorest. It's so low class. It's so like, that's so ghetto. Like, people are like, I can imagine being a person not of a minority. Well, I can try to imagine. And growing up, and if that's all you see, then it might be a little easier to convince you to do it when it comes to like a college situation when it's all white people in a fraternity house, because you're not connecting that cocaine with the cocaine that you knew growing up, because these are all your rich friends that are all just sitting, like I can imagine that's an easier way to get in there. So I think the stigma is so strong because of its groundedness and like minority, and that's what affects, like you said, the government and the laws. But I don't necessarily think that translates into like popular. I can't even think of many other movies besides Superbad. Have you guys seen that?
No.
You gotta watch Superbad. It's so funny. But like Superbad was a movie that there was cocaine use in, and it was like rich white people.
Bright Lights, Big City. That was one that had Michael Fox or Jimmy Conway.
Huh?
Yeah. So the character's name was Michael Fox, but it was Jimmy Conway.
But even still, like I'm sure that's the scenario that's based around is probably in some way well off or not poor white people. Like I don't really see that many situations where you're in like a crack house, like white people in a crack house portrayed on TV or in movies. And, maybe I'm just sensitive to that content, so I don't seek out shows like that or something, but I don't see that depiction, or at least didn't. Maybe now I see it more, but I didn't in the 90s growing up, like when my formative years where, I was making a connection between drugs and the real world. I saw cocaine portrayed as a white drug and crack portrayed as like this horrible drug that black people do in inner cities. If there was an organic form of cocaine, I think that might be a good thing. I think that might be something that would take longer to most of the harm that I see, at least with cocaine, is in the mixing process to get to that paste. It's not in the coca leaf. Like there's no stigma attached to that. And that's what our whole podcast here has been about. Like the coca leaf itself is not dangerous. It's not harmful. There's no stigma. Maybe, them human sacrifices would maybe disagree if they were here to tell the tale. But there's no stigma attached there. It is the cocaine. And the cocaine happens because of the process with all the chemicals. And that is wild. So what we're saying is don't do drugs and avoid anybody named Phil with a backpack.
Yeah. I guess we should probably answer our research question a bit more definitively.
Oh, sure.
Like where do we all think that coca becomes the stigmatized cocaine and like all of that? And I'm sure that whole sentence could be worded much better.
I think that cocaine goes from being harmless and coca to the stigmatized cocaine once it becomes racialized, and once it goes into the racial or socioeconomic categories. And that, so when it gets to America and it got to America through minorities, then it becomes a racial issue. I think that if cocaine was coming into this country from people named Harry and Chap or something like that, and it was coming from Amsterdam, I don't think it would be as much of an issue, or Great Britain or something like that. I don't think that it would be a huge issue. Even the IRA was bringing in massive amounts of guns at a certain point to New York, and that wasn't that big of an issue. But when Mexican cartels do it, it's a problem. And the aim was the same. Actually, the IRA, in contrast, might have had a more violent aim than Mexican cartels, because Mexican cartels were just trying to protect their business, whereas the IRA was actively going to be, they should be considered a terrorist organization, but that's a whole other political topic.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think the racialization starts? Like, is it when it enters the United States, or is it also how I think specifically white Americans view cartels and people in Latin America in general? Because, like, I think that for me, I think that's where it starts, is how Americans view people from Latin America, and it's all cartels and it's all violent and don't go there, you're gonna get killed, and that's where it's bad. I think it's almost where it starts.
So I think it starts more so in Latin America in itself. I don't even think it's like the process itself, like the plant itself. Like you had to have the president sit down like in a conference and say to the world that coca is not cocaine, that it's just a plant, that it's completely harmless, that they sit around and chew it for days. And it's a cultural thing. I think that when the United States sees anyone from the Latin American region, they see someone that sees some type of profit or sees America as like the free land or like somewhere where they can go and get like another opportunity. And that's, and you have people here that feel like being born in the U.S. is like a birthright, and that people who aren't from here need to go through either legal obligations to come here, and another political issue would be immigration and illegal immigrants and things like that. But I think that it starts with seeing like just the people in general, and then to add on to it, as Natalie was saying earlier, when you finally complete like the coca paste and like complete making cocaine, and then it enters the United States, and then you have like the different racial disparities between like crack cocaine and then like the powder cocaine, and then you also can inject cocaine into your system. So I think it just goes a lot further.
I just can't believe people are snorting gasoline. I'm still
it's
stuck
just the
on
big
it.
thing of the podcast.
It's just, why would you do that? That's wild. Yeah, I think America's influence on, so I guess it's like what came first, the chicken or the egg, like it had to be stigmatized in some way in America already for us to care about it in other places, and then the stigma in Latin America really came from America's influence, the war on drugs, and us not being able, like, who does that? First, of the many things that upset me about America's policies, you decided that drugs aren't cool for your country. So you say, you know what? Nobody in the world can do drugs. But instead of actually like focusing on other countries in the world, you just picked on the lowest hanging fruit. And you said, because I don't want to do drugs, that means that this little guy over here can't do it. Like, why didn't you bring that big talk to Russia? Why didn't you bring that big talk to freaking even like Prague? You didn't try to do that anywhere else but Latin America? Like, what? And I get it. Latin America can grow the drugs, but you can't tell me that Russia's not, like when it was prohibition, did they try to get Russians to stop making vodka? They sure didn't. They sure didn't.
I think you see that in a lot of different things too, like how the United States during the Cold War like influenced Latin America in not good ways, but it's the communism is bad. We don't like communism. So if there's any potential of a leftist government in Latin America, that was bad. Whether it was communist or not is beside the point. And so it's any foreign policy the United States has had with developing countries in any period of time over the past 200 years.
Yeah.
We don't like it, so you can't like it, and you can't have it, and we will stop it. And it's not right. But that's what they did.
mean, I'd rather be a part of it than not, I guess. You know, I'd rather be an American than not, because I'd probably just get bullied somewhere else. But it's not fun. Like, I'm not enjoying it. I wouldn't say I'm proud of it. But, that's the great part about America, though. That's the one thing that I can hold on to and have hope in, our democracy. Because even though we hate the, like, clearly bullshit systems that are in place that really do pick on the little guy, even though that exists, there's still a chance for change through a democratic process. And that I can appreciate, because I can have hope that those things will change. Don't shatter that hope. Don't look at me like that. Like, you're like, well, let me tell you. I can still hold on to that hope.
Cocaine within America has been shifted from being, a helpful remedy in like the 30s and the 40s, as an everyday ailment, to an evil tool for the cartels, which is pretty much seen as being hell-bent on destroying American families. So due to the war on drugs, the portrayal of cocaine and cocaine users / dealers in the movies, which was stated earlier, can be seen as radically motivated, and it's also seen as, or it does increase addiction / death rates. We kind of, looked at the political issues surrounding coca and the cocaine paste, and ultimately we all can agree that we are not condoning doing drugs in any way, shape, or form. Stay away from that booger sugar. We are all trying to say ultimately that coca and cocaine are two totally different things. And everyone have a good day, and enjoy the rest of your semester.